Well, hello, everyone. This is going to be a very short lecture introducing one of the main themes of my new course, The Gothic Cosmos, Part 2, Laboratories, Labyrinths, and the Luminous Abyss. It's a sequel, or rather, the second part of a two-part course on the history and the culture of the Gothic going back to the 18th century. But in this second part, if you will, we're really going to be focusing on the later 19th century into the 20th century and looking at the way very specific themes that have their origin in the Gothic in the 18th century and then sort of come into their dark flowering in the Romantic period, how these things persist, and how, in many ways, I think the argument can be made the primary mode of cultural production in the West, indeed, even in popular global culture, is inflected through a Gothic lens. So, again, this is not going to be a full lecture, but I just wanted to do this sort of as a pitch uh, to introduce you to one of the main themes that I'm going to be touching on in the second part of the class. So, or I should say, in this second part of this sort of two-part exploration, if you will, the Gothic cosmos. So I'm calling this Gothic Spaces and the Body, pushing limits, opening the mind, and transforming the body. So again, the laboratory, the labyrinth, and then what I'm calling the luminous abyss are sort of three sites, sites, or spaces, or sort of settings where the Gothic body in particular is sort of unfolding itself, right? Or meeting its setting so that it can create the Gothic affect that the authors and the artists and that the consumers of Gothic media want to experience. So, what are some of these images that I have for you here on the first slide? Well, the first is, of course, Victor Frankenstein and his creation, Frankenstein's monster, probably the most famous or one of the most famous examples of a Gothic body in Gothic literature. The second image is a really moving painting from the 1880s by George Watts of the Minotaur looking out over the ocean. And then the final image that I have for you is this really wonderful image from the early 20th century of an illustration for Edgar Allan Poe's novella, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, translated by Baudelaire, um, with this wonderful illustration. And as we'll see in a minute, this whole idea of the luminous abyss is something that Poe, drawing on a lot of the literature of the Gothic and but particularly the Romantic, as we get into this idea of the sublime, this idea of the abyss or the gateway into the other world that is actually luminous, is something that shows up a lot in Poe's stories. So these three images of these sort of three different bodies, right? The Frankenstein's monster, the Minotaur, and then this sort of spectral skeleton overlooking the ship, sort of at the end of the world. These three things are bodies in relationship to these three types of Gothic spaces: the laboratory, the labyrinth, and the luminous abyss. So let's jump in. So, again, as I say, because the theme for this short lecture is really about how the body, plays out in Gothic, in sort of a Gothic frame, using these three types of spaces. Let's talk first about the laboratory. So, the laboratory is the Gothic space, really, of transgression. So the laboratory is the place of forbidden knowledge. Think about alchemy, think about this space, particularly in Faust, right, where he's doing things like trying to create a homunculus. Meanwhile, he's also making a pact with the devil. So here the human attempt to cross thresholds once reserved for gods, either to create life, to animate matter, to master death itself. We can sort of see this from the myth of Prometheus, all the way, as I say, into Dr. Faustus, and then, of course, Victor Frankenstein sort of being like the ultimate example of that in the Gothic period. So the image that I have for you here is, of course, this wonderful Victorian engraving with some wonderful hand coloring as I say, of Dr. Faust with the homunculus in the beaker, the little man that he's creating. And for those of you who've taken my classes in the past, including things like a cultural history of robots or my course on the femme fatale, I talk a lot about Dr. Karen Horney's idea of womb envy. How, according to her, she was a student of Freud who then pushed back against his penis envy theory. She said women don't have penis envy, men have womb envy. And you certainly see that, in the writings of Paracelsus and Faust, all the way down to our own day. All of these men who very often will incarnate, right, the archetype of the mad scientist, are obsessed with the creation of life apart from a woman. And so there's this whole idea that men are trying to get to the secrets of nature, so much so that they want to be able to generate life itself without a woman even being present or participating in the process. Frankenstein, of course, written by a woman, is also, I think, an early example of this idea of womb envy. And the image I have for you here is just a contemporary cover from, the Wordsworth Classics edition, showing this electrical dynamo. And we're going to talk about electricity in a second. So thinking about the laboratory as the Gothic space, right, where a body is being generated. But I want to take it over to the female archetypal side. And again, as I've said, I did a large two-part course on the history of the femme fatale, which was great fun. And in the second half of the class, the femme fatale number 2, we talked about Snow White's wicked stepmother and this idea of the sort of enchantress. So I think there's also something here if we think about, the evil queen, Snow White's wicked stepmother, as being one of these Gothic figures inside a laboratory. However, there's a little bit of a difference, right? So an illustration from one of my favorite illustrators and also an early mentor of mine, Trina Shart Hyman, showing the queen from Snow White in her laboratory, right? But the laboratory of the evil queen is more alchemical, and it's more about mirrors and potions and spells and older forms of transformational magic. But what makes her Gothic is this fusion of control and then also this idea of unraveling. There's a tragic seed, right, that's always nascent or always planted sort of in the center of Gothic stories. Something's going to go wrong. So the desire to know, Faust, Dr. Frankenstein are trying to master it. But here, the sort of female archetype of vanity is being woven into this. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all, right? So the laboratory here is not about mastery so much as it is a kind of a psychic intensification. And of course, in the end, this self, this sort of double self, the evil queen turning herself into a crone, right? She actually ends up, being destroyed, right? And so I think that one of the things that I also want to do in the class is, of course, we're going to be thinking about sort of the masculine mad scientist character, but I also want us to be thinking about where the female archetype in the laboratory shows up, right? Whether it's the wicked queen from Snow White at her incantations within her own sort of lair. There are other examples of this, of course, and I think it's important to explore those. So in the first half of the class, we looked a lot at the history, right? What was going on in the scientific world at the time. And a big part of this sort of Gothic laboratory sort of set of tropes is the reanimating of corpses. And a lot of that, of course, comes out of Galvani's experiments, these different types of experiments that were being done with cadavers and electrical currents in the 18th and the early 19th century. And that, of course, plays a prominent role in the Frankenstein story. But if you carry this forward into the idea of the mad scientist and you think about these really sort of crazy movies about things like, the brain in the vat or the disembodied head that's being kept alive, that's also a major trope. And there's a real sort of horror in this also, right? So part of the Gothic laboratory is the Gothic experiment of the transgression of reanimating the dead or putting something together and then bringing it to life, right? Like automata, things like that. So to know too much is to lose control of what one has made. That's this, the old Greek idea, of course, of hubris. It comes up a lot sort of in the Western imagination. But in the Gothic period and then sort of the neo-Gothic movement moving forward, it's central. It's so central, right? Particularly in stories of overreach. And then, of course, in our own time, if you think about how this space extends outward into, systems like AI, biotech, mass surveillance, the Gothic laboratory is no longer just sort of a secret chamber, right? It becomes a kind of a civilizational condition. So some images, mid-century, from one of these popular, I think, Time Life science books of a scientist or a technician in their laboratory. If you think about sort of the appurtenances, the objects of the Gothic laboratory, these are things that have entered sort of the collective visual lexicon, right? There's a shorthand. Immediately we see something like this, and there's a whole range of like immediate conclusions that we as consumers of Gothic media will jump to. Who is this person? What are they up to? Right? There's very often sort of a sinister cast. It's a major trope in our science fiction and our horror fiction and the way that we visualize these things. So, like Faust or Frankenstein, the lab is the place where the building blocks of life become playthings of the ego, right? Back to that sort of Faustian idea. And so I just, of course, had to put up an image of one of these data centers because that is central along with these, robots, whether we're talking about, the DARPA dogs or these other sort of uncanny valley figures that Silicon Valley and all of these other tech companies seem to keep pushing onto the public, which in certain ways feels somewhat archaic to me. I feel almost like we're kind of ready to move on to something different. And yet, and this is a part of why I wanted to teach the second half of this class, I believe, I bring this up also in my class on the history of robots, that so much of the sort of problematic issues that we're dealing with have to do with the fact that we are really working with very outdated metaphors that are deeply patriarchal, deeply misogynistic, deeply technocratic, and also just rooted in a very 19th century imperialist way of thinking about matter in the individual, right? And society and the idea of the genius, right? So that's the laboratory, right? The second space I want to talk about and its relationship to sort of the body in this sort of Gothic series of mise en scène, if you will, is this idea of the labyrinth. So, if the Gothic laboratory is the place of transgression and overreach, and the Faustian desire to keep pushing forward, then the labyrinth is the Gothic space of disorientation. And obviously, the labyrinth goes back to the story of, Daedalus and Theseus and the Minotaur, Ariadne, King Minos, all that stuff. But if you're thinking about sort of Gothic literature, the maze, the sort of wickerwork of tunnels that figures get lost in, particularly in these castles or these houses, it becomes a central stage for the working out of Gothic consciousness and the Gothic body. So there's this idea of confusion, of recursion, right? And also existential entrapment, which is certainly going to be picked up in the 20th century. So, unlike the laboratory, which is about mastery, the labyrinth denies mastery, right? It's a structure designed not to be solved, but to absorb the subject into its logic. And I think in a weird way, that also represents kind of the dark side, the dystopian idea of modernity, right? And this comes up, of course, in so much existential, like science fiction, this idea of the self or consciousness being lost in time loops or strange places that where there's this sort of repetition compulsion. The surrealists, of course, had a great time with this, and we'll talk about that in the class. But I also wanted to show an image of Giovanni Battista Piranesi's prisons. He did this whole series of engravings in the 18th century, which really have a big impact on sort of Gothic sensibility, then the dark romantic, and then certainly much later in the 20th century, people like Escher are picking up this idea of these incredible spaces, which are architectural, but really seem to exist in a different dimension, right? In a kind of a dream world. So the labyrinth here is no longer horizontal, but it's vertical and it's also infinite. So it's a structure of the mind in which movement only deepens one's confinement, right? So, you know, we sort of have examples of this in the first great Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. This is a really fun image from the short animated version of that done by Jan Svankmajer, which is available on YouTube, right? So sort of figures in these underground chambers, very reminiscent of Piranesi. And of course, Svankmajer knows these engravings and is working with a lot of that type of imagery. But think about how in the 20th century, somebody like Jorge Luis Borges or before him, Franz Kafka, are employing this idea of sort of recursion, which is both architectural as well as mental and existential, right? And it creates a real nightmare effect. Think about The Shining, right? That final scene, the maze, and there's the maquette of the maze in the hotel, and then there's the maze out in outside of the hotel, right? So there's also this idea that the labyrinth and the mirror share something. Picasso even picks this up in his image of the Minotaur and Theseus. There's a mirroring, right? Case in point. So this is an image by George Frederick Watts from 1885, one of my favorite Victorian paintings. So Watts reimagines the labyrinth center as a space of brooding, of anticipatory violence. And think about the Minotaur as the monster, right? And, you know, every 7 years, the Athenian youths and maidens are sacrificed to him, but he is a very sad, he's a hybrid, right? Who's kept in the center of this maze, or labyrinth rather, created by Daedalus, because he's also the product, at least according to the classical story, of a kind of a divine crime, right? Pasiphae, you know, the bull from the sea is not sacrificed, and so Pasiphae develops a passion for the bull, and then, you know, has Daedalus make the cow that she hides inside so she can copulate with the sacred bull, and the Minotaur comes out of that, right? So, but the Minotaur in the modern way of thinking represents something much more psychological. So, as I say, the horror is no longer just the maze or the labyrinth, but it's the inevitability of what it contains, right? And also going back to The Shining, thinking about how at the very end of that film, you know, Jack and Danny are sort of like, in a sense, it's sort of like Theseus and the Minotaur, right? It's this, the monster and then the child hero. Um, and it's interesting, isn't it, how these motifs that are so deeply a part of not just the Western imagination, but also the tropologies of the Gothic really continue. And because they operate in a very specific way that resonates with us, right? We share this language. I had to share this image. Fabrizio Clerici is one of my favorite. He's not, well, is he technically a surrealist? He is. He was friends with Leonor Fini. He's an Italian modernist, deeply influenced by surrealism. But his images are incredibly architectonic. This is one of my favorite paintings by him. This is the Minotaur publicly accusing his mother. And he very often will turn these sort of mythological, almost sort of Freudian scenes into these wonderful, you know, think back to Piranesi, these sort of architectural fantasies. And it also looks like a stage set, and he also did set designs. Um, I just think this is really wonderful. So the monster emerges into visibility, not as a hidden threat, but as an accuser. Right? It's getting very Freudian, suggesting that the true horror of the labyrinth is not merely entrapment, but the exposure of Origen's guilt and the inescapable violence of one's own creation. Right? So thinking about the Minotaur accusing Pasiphae, in a sense, it's kind of a recapitulation of the sort of parent child relationship in so many of those types of relationships. I didn't ask to be born. This life is so monstrous, and you're the one who brought me into it, right? You find that a lot in the Gothic imagination. One of the things that we will be looking at in the class, what I do want to say is I am trained as a historian. And so very often I do like to do things chronologically, but of course I also like to do them thematically. But in this second half of the Gothic cosmos, which starts May 3rd, by the way, we will be talking a lot about the Gothic revival in architecture. So, neo medievalism in the Victorian era, how it relates to the sort of Dickensian world, to Dickens' writing, right? To the way that London is not only literally reinvented during the Second Industrial Revolution, but the way that literature, the arts, sociology, consciousness is in a sense also reinvented in the Victorian period. And so much of this has to do with thinking about London as a kind of very dark labyrinth, right? I mean, everything from this image, which comes out of Gustave Doré's incredible illustrations for the text called London, and we're going to be talking about that book in great detail. Um, but also just thinking about like something like Jack the Ripper, and, the Whitechapel murders, and this idea of London as labyrinth, where monsters await us, it becomes very, very much a part of the Victorian imagination within the Gothic revival, right? So, and of course, this ties into Marx's theories about labor, all that stuff, because so many of these people have come in from the countryside. They are totally dislocated, right, in so many ways from the spaces of their own origin. When I teach my fairy class, I often talk about this, right? This sense of grief and disorientation that so many people who come to cities like London in the 19th century are feeling, being cut off from their spiritual center or from their original life ways. So the labyrinth becomes almost like a kind of, in the sense of Dante, a kind of labyrinthian inferno, right? And I had to put this up because a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the class is, of course, cinema. We're going to do a whole week on the way that the Victorian Gothic migrates into Weimar cinema, into film noir, into a lot of the sort of dark Gothic, neo-Gothic types of cinema. And of course, these are two images from Orson Welles' masterpiece, The Lady from Shanghai. That should say 1947, not 1974. And of course, if you know this film, you know towards the end of the film, there's this incredible scene or series of scenes that unfold inside the mirror maze, right, of this fun house. And from a cinematographic point of view, and from a storytelling point of view, it's absolutely incredible. Recapitulating this idea of, a figure or a series of figures trapped in this labyrinth. And again, in thinking about the idea of the labyrinth as a mirror, right, or the maze as a mirror, you have this idea of the self, its reflection, and then sort of the recursion, right? And it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying, but it's also rather magical because I don't know if you've ever been inside one of these things, but you have to go very slowly because you don't always know if you're going to like bump up against glass and smash your nose. So Wells uses that the nature of the mirror maze and its disorienting effect on the body, right, as a very, very important plot point and setting in the climactic scene of this film. Okay, so the laboratory, we've talked about the labyrinth, and now I want to talk about the luminous abyss. There actually are, I mean, I love this phrase. I have found it in many different texts in the Victorian period. And it's just a wonderful, I think, descriptor for something that shows up a lot, particularly in romantic painting, and then carries forward into science fiction even. So what do I mean when I talk about the luminous abyss? It's the Gothic space of overwhelming revelation. And again, if we're thinking about a body or bodies being set into a luminous abyss, you see this so much in the paintings of Turner. You see it in John Martin's work. We'll be talking a lot about this in the class because it's one of the sort of three spaces that we're going to keep returning to. Um, but it's also this idea of the encounter with the infinite. I gave a talk which is available through Morbid Anatomy and also on my YouTube page called How Does Your Gothic Glow? And I did a very deep dive sort of into the sort of genealogy of images around the luminous abyss. And in the class, we will talk about how that type of luminous painting, history painting, very, very dramatic form of painting, gets animated through things like the Ido Fusicon and these different types of very early sort of fairground technologies, the magic lantern. And there's a direct through line that you can trace into early cinema, right? Um, so, but sort of from a philosophical aesthetic point of view, right? And also as it shows up in literature when we read the phrase the luminous abyss, it's a realm in which light does not illuminate in a comforting sense, right? But instead reveals something vast, impersonal, and ultimately indifferent to human existence. In the dark romantic tradition, nature itself becomes this abyss. It's not pastoral, but it's overwhelming. A huge part of the romantic tradition is, of course, the pastoral, the comforts of nature, the succor that we derive, right, from this sort of thing. But this is the opposite of that. This is sort of this terrifying thing. And so, an image for you, of course, of Turner, Shipwreck, another image from John Martin of Adam and Eve fleeing or being kicked out of Eden. We'll talk a lot about John Martin, who did a lot of illustrations to Milton. This is from Paradise Lost, mezzotint. And you can see how the luminous abyss shows up as all these different, the light coming through the clouds, the light coming out of the gate to Eden, even the river through the valley of this primeval world is sort of glowing. Two more images of Satan or Lucifer and Pandemonium. You see this all the time in John Martin's paintings or his illustrations. Whether you're in the underworld and Pandemonium, whether you're, in heaven or whether you're on earth, there's some kind of a portal or a gateway in nature, which is also resonant with the powers of supernature, right? And it's very often some kind of a doorway into another world, and it's glowing and it's terrifying usually. Poe, this shows up a lot in Poe's stories. We're going to talk a lot about Edgar Allan Poe, an illustration from one of his very strange dialogues, the conversation of Iros and Charmian, and then, or is it the colloquy of Iros and Charmian? That's the colloquy of Monos and Una. He writes a series of really weird stories between these sort of supernatural characters who are in these weird sort of luminous abysses or voids, right? Wonderful illustration by an Italian illustrator. And then that incredible scene from the end of Arthur Gordon Pym, where just as they are reaching the end of the world, there's this weird valley of mist, and it's almost opens like a kind of a portal, and they see this incredible glowing figure, and you don't know if they're hallucinating or if it's some kind of like something out of H.P. Lovecraft. You don't know what this is, and that's where the story ends. So many illustrators have had a field day when they illustrate the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of showing this primordial figure in the luminous abyss or the void at the end of the world, right? So this abyss is an excess of illumination, and very often it leads to death or the end of the story. And of course, had to put up Disney's The Black Hole from 1979, which haunts the imaginations of many a Gen Xer. The black hole is not invisible. Well, maybe the center is, but it's this incredible glowing whirlpool, looking a little bit more like, sort of a spiral galaxy, right? But at the end of this, there's something very supernatural and strange that happens. Sorry, spoiler, when they go through the black hole. The villain is reincarnated, or we don't know what this actually means, but he's inside the body of this robot that he's been controlling, who's sort of his servant. So it's sort of this idea of the inventor and the monster coming together, being placed into one body. And he's definitely in hell, looking a lot like Lucifer or Satan in John Martin's Pandemonium. And then there's an incredible image of what's like an angel flying down this sort of crystalline hallway that looks very much like a Gothic cathedral. So, at any rate, I was also reminded in thinking about the black hole going back to Dante, so much of the Gothic, because the Gothic is neo-medieval, is derived from the images in Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Divine Comedy. So Satan in the very depths of hell in that frozen lake, and then Beatrice and Dante seeing the beatific vision. Very, very similar to the images that you even see in Disney's Black Hole. I am fascinated by the way that these Gothic images repeat over and over again. That's a big part of what we're going to be exploring. It's a way that I love to teach these echoes, particularly visual echoes across time, because they're drawing on a common trough of cultural productions, right? So, if you're interested in these things, I hope you will join me for the Gothic Cosmos Part 2, Laboratories, Labyrinths, and the Luminous Abyss. Starts May 3rd through Morbid Anatomy. Thanks so much, everyone. Hope to see you.